Some stories in the Bible are not meant to be simple. They don't follow the rules we expect. They feel like riddles whispered to us across thousands of years. And tonight, we have one of the greatest riddles of all. God chooses a man to be his champion. He sends him on the most important mission in the world, and then, on the road to that mission, he tries to end him. Chapter 1. Life in Midian. The sun was a merciless bronze eye in the vast pale sky, bleaching the world below to shades of sand and dust. For Moses, the desert was both a refuge and a prison. Each day bled into the next, with a monotonous rhythm dictated by the needs of the flock. He guided the sheep across the barren expanse, his shepherd's staff tapping a lonely cadence against the stones. The silence out here was immense, broken only by the bleating of a lamb or the whisper of the hot wind. It was in that silence that the ghosts of his past found their voice. Memories of Egypt rose like heat, shimmer on the horizon. He recalled the cool, shaded halls of the palace, the scent of lotus blossoms in the gardens, the weight of gold and expectation upon his shoulders. He had been a prince, raised in opulence and power, a future he had shattered with one rash, violent act. The face of the Egyptian overseer he had killed sometimes flashed before his eyes, a stark reminder of the life he had fled. Here, in Midian, he was no one, a fugitive, a shepherd. The title felt foreign even after years, a coarse garment that never quite fit his frame. As the sun began its descent, painting the dunes in shades of ochre and violet, Moses led the flock back toward the tents of his father-in-law, Jethro. The sight of the simple dwellings, smoke curling lazily from a cook fire, should have brought comfort. Instead, it often sharpened the edge of his loneliness. He was an outsider here, too, a man with a history no one fully understood. Inside their tent, the air was thick with the aroma of baking bread. His wife, Zipporah, moved with a quiet efficiency, her hands dusted with flour. She glanced up as he entered, her dark eyes missing nothing. She saw the distant look in his gaze, the way his shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with the day's labor. She approached him, her presence a gentle anchor in the storm of his thoughts. She placed a hand on his arm, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. He tried to articulate the turmoil within, the shapeless doubts that gnawed at him. He spoke of feeling adrift, a man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. He confessed his fears, that he had squandered his purpose, that he was meant for something more than this endless wandering with sheep, yet was too flawed, too marked by failure, to ever achieve it. He felt like a vessel emptied, a tool rusting in the disuse of the desert. Zipporah listened, her expression a mixture of love and concern. She did not dismiss his fears with easy platitudes. Instead, she offered the solid ground of her faith in him, her quiet strength, a counterpoint to his restless uncertainty. She reminded him of the man she knew, not the Prince of Egypt, nor the haunted fugitive, but the good man who cared for her father's flocks and protected his family. Yet her reassurance, while warming him, could not fully dispel the chill of isolation that had taken root in his soul. As night fell, enveloping the desert in a blanket of stars, Moses lay awake, listening to the sounds of his sleeping family, feeling the immense, silent judgment of the wilderness, and wondering if this quiet, anonymous life in Midian was his final, forgotten destiny. Chapter 2. The burning bush, the desert held its breath. For days, a peculiar tension had thickened the air, a silent hum that vibrated just below the threshold of hearing. Moses felt it in the unnatural stillness of the sheep, in the way the very sunlight seemed to press down with a heavier, more expectant weight. He led his flock toward the western slopes of Horeb, the mountain of God, a place the local shepherds avoided with superstitious murmurs. The terrain here was rougher, a jagged landscape of black rock and deep shadows that felt ancient and watchful. It was a place that seemed to remember things, and Moses, burdened by his own memories, felt a strange kinship with its stark solitude. Then he saw it. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the light, a sunbeam catching a patch of dry brush in a particularly brilliant way. But as he drew nearer, his shepherd's instincts, honed by years of reading the subtle language of the wilderness, told him this was different. The fire did not behave as fire should. It did not crackle and consume. It did not send up a column of gray smoke or leave a smoldering ruin in its wake. It was a pure, untamed blaze of amber and gold, a contained inferno that danced and shimmered with impossible life. The bush itself remained utterly intact, every thorn and leaf etched in brilliant fiery detail against the dull rock behind it. It was a contradiction made manifest, a miracle of sustained destruction, burning with a fierce, silent energy that defied every law of the natural world. A profound and reverent curiosity seized him. He left the flock to graze on a sparse patch of grass, his entire being focused on the spectacle. He moved closer, his feet carrying him forward almost without his conscious command. The heat should have been unbearable, a wall of force to push him back, yet he felt only a strange, resonant warmth that seemed to emanate not from the flames but from the very center of his own being. The air around the bush shimmered, charged with a power that was both terrifying and beautiful. He could see every individual flame, each one a tongue of living light that licked the air without ever tasting the brittle branches it enveloped. It was holiness made visible, a sacred mystery unfolding in the barren wilderness. He was close enough now to see the intricate patterns. The fire traced upon the leaves a celestial script written in light. He stood transfixed, his mind emptied of Egypt, of Midian, of his own fears and failings. There was only the bush and the fire and the profound waiting silence. And then, from the heart of the impossible blaze, a voice called his name. Moses! It was not a sound that traveled through the air to reach his ears. It was a resonance that bloomed directly within him, a vibration that shook the foundations of his soul. It was a voice of absolute authority, yet layered with an intimacy that knew him to his core, knew the prince, the murderer, the shepherd, the husband, the father. It was the voice of the universe speaking his singular name. The shock of it was physical, a jolt that paralyzed his limbs and stole the breath from his lungs. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. A primal fear, colder than any desert night, washed over him, and instinctively he hid his face, falling to the ground, unable to bear the weight of the presence that had just spoken from the heart of the fire. The voice that had named him now filled the space around him, a presence so immense it seemed to press the very air from his lungs. It spoke from the heart of the undying fire, its words not merely heard, but felt, etching themselves upon his spirit. The voice declared itself the God of his ancestors, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob. It spoke of having seen the misery of his people in Egypt, of hearing their cries under the whips of their slave masters. A divine anguish, a righteous fury tempered by profound compassion, resonated in every syllable. The voice declared its intention to rescue the Israelites from their bondage and to lead them to a land flowing with milk and honey. And then came the command, a directive that shattered the quiet trajectory of Moses' life in Midian. He was to go. He, Moses, was to be the instrument of this deliverance. He was to appear before Pharaoh and demand the release of God's firstborn son, Israel. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through the awe. The command was impossible, a summons to a death sentence. The face of the current Pharaoh, a man of absolute power whom he had once called grandson, rose in his mind, hard and unforgiving. The memory of his own crime, the Egyptian overseer lying dead in the sand, was a brand of guilt that made him flinch. How could he, a wanted man, a forgotten shepherd, stand in that gilded court and make such a demand? A torrent of protest surged within him. Who was he to undertake such a thing? He was nobody, a man whose own life was a story of failure and flight. The grandeur of the call only magnified his own sense of inadequacy. The voice from the fire responded not to his spoken words, but to the desperate silent cry of his heart. It promised him a presence. "I will be with you," the voice declared, a simple statement that carried the weight of cosmic certainty. As a sign, the voice told him that when he had brought the people out of Egypt, they would worship on this very mountain. The promise was an anchor cast into the future, a guarantee of a journey completed. Yet doubt, that old and familiar companion, clung to him. If he went to the Israelites and told them the God of their fathers had sent him, they would ask for a name. What should he tell them? The voice from the burning bush answered with a declaration of self-existent being, a name that was a verb, an eternal present. I am who I am. He was to tell them that I am had sent him. It was a name that spoke of ultimate reality, of a being utterly independent and uncreated, the ground of all that is. Still, Moses resisted, the fear a cold stone in his belly. He argued that the people would not believe him, that they would not listen to his voice. They would say that this God had not appeared to him at all. In response, the voice asked him what he held in his hand. "A staff," Moses replied, his mind still reeling. The voice commanded him to throw it on the ground. He obeyed, and the wooden shepherd's staff became a living, hissing serpent, coiling upon the hot sand. Moses recoiled in instinctive horror. The voice then commanded him to reach out and take it by the tail. With a trembling hand he did so, and the serpent became a staff once more, solid and familiar in his grip. It was a lesson in transformed purpose, a demonstration that the ordinary tools of his humble life could become instruments of divine power. Another sign was given. He was told to put his hand inside his cloak. When he withdrew it, his flesh was leprous, white as snow. A cry of revulsion caught in his throat. He was commanded to put his hand back in, and when he drew it out again, it was restored as healthy as the other. The power to afflict and to heal resided with the voice in the fire. But Moses, his spirit buckling under the weight of the call, offered one final desperate protest. He was not a man of words, not now, not ever. He was slow of speech and tongue, his eloquence lost in the long silence of the desert. The voice from the bush answered with a question that silenced all further argument. Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. The finality of the statement left no room for debate. The burning bush continued to blaze, a silent, fiery witness to the covenant being forged in that desolate place. The command was given, the objections were answered, and the promise of divine accompaniment was absolute. The path back to Egypt, a road he had never thought to tread again, now lay before him, illuminated by the terrifying and glorious light of a bush that would not be consumed. Chapter 3. Telling Zipporah. The walk back to the tents of Jethro was a journey through a world remade. The familiar desert landscape, once a canvas of monotonous solitude, now seemed charged with a latent significance, every stone and shadow whispering of the divine encounter. The weight of the staff in Moses' hand felt different, no longer just a tool for herding sheep, but a vessel of terrifying potential. The memory of its transformation into a serpent, the feel of its cool, scaled skin becoming rough wood again, was a phantom sensation that made his palm tingle. The voice from the fire echoed in the chambers of his mind, a resonant hum that drowned out the whisper of the wind. He was no longer just Moses, the shepherd, the fugitive, the husband. He was Moses, the chosen of I Am, and the knowledge was a yoke both glorious and crushing. He found Zipporah outside their tent, grinding grain with a steady, rhythmic motion. The sight of her, bent over the quirned stone in the fading afternoon light, was a portrait of normalcy that felt suddenly painfully distant. She looked up as he approached, her smile fading as she read the turmoil on his face. His eyes held a new light, a haunted, fervent intensity that she had never seen before. He moved as a man in a dream, his steps heavy with a purpose that seemed to bow his shoulders. Inside the tent's dim, lamp-lit interior, the scent of herbs and earth enveloped them. He sat beside her, the words he had rehearsed on the long walk home clotting in his throat. How could he possibly convey the unearthly reality of what had happened? He began haltingly, describing the bush that burned without being consumed, the light that was not of this world. He spoke of the voice that had called his name from the heart of the flames, a sound that was felt more than heard. He told her of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and of the divine mandate that had shattered the quiet trajectory of their lives. He was to go to Egypt. He was to stand before Pharaoh. He was to demand freedom for a nation of slaves. As he spoke, Zipporah listened with an unwavering stillness, her dark eyes fixed on his. She saw not a man deluded by the desert sun, but a man transformed by a truth too immense to be fabricated. The fear in his voice was real, but beneath it, she heard the solid, unshakable foundation of a genuine calling. She did not interrupt, did not question the impossibility of it all. When he finally fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air between them, she reached out and took his work-roughened hands in her own. Her touch was an anchor. She did not offer empty reassurance, but a quiet, formidable declaration of solidarity. She would go with him. Wherever this path led, they would walk it together. Yet, as her initial shock subsided, a mother's practical fears began to surface, threading through her resolve like cold needles. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the tent where their young son Gershom lay sleeping, his breath a soft, even rhythm in the quiet. This journey was not just about her husband and his God, it was about their child. The road to Egypt was long and fraught with perils, thirst, hunger, bandits, and the relentless, unforgiving sun. and Egypt itself was a den of vipers, a place where Moses was a wanted man and where a powerful king would see their mission as an act of treason. The image of Gershom, so small and trusting, facing the dangers of the wilderness and the hostility of a royal court, sent a cold dread coiling through her heart. Her support for her husband was absolute, but it was a support tempered by the fierce, protective love she held for their son. The path ahead, illuminated by holy fire, was also shadowed by the very real human fear for the safety of their child. Chapter 4. Packing for the Trip. The morning sun rose over Midian, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch toward Egypt. The familiar routines of the shepherd's life were now imbued with a frantic, purposeful energy. The air inside the tent was thick with the scent of dried meat and parched grain, a practical perfume for the journey ahead. Zipporah moved with a quiet, efficient grace, her hands a blur of motion as she sorted through their meager possessions. Woolen blankets were rolled tight, water skins were inspected for leaks, and a small clay lamp was wrapped carefully in cloth. Each item represented a calculation of necessity against the burden of its weight, a balance between survival and the ability to move swiftly through the unforgiving desert. Moses watched her, his own hands clumsy as he tied bundles of dates and figs. A nervous energy thrummed just beneath his skin, a stark contrast to the deep, resolute determination that had taken root in his soul. His gaze kept drifting to the shepherd's staff, leaning against the tent pole. It looked no different than it had for 40 years, a gnarled length of wood, smoothed by the grip of his hand. Yet the memory of its transformation was seared into his mind, a constant, terrifying reminder of the power that now accompanied his mission. Every time he looked at it, he felt a fresh wave of awe and a cold spike of fear. He was a vessel for a divine purpose, but he still felt like the same man, a man who had fled, who had failed, whose tongue was slow, and whose courage felt like a fragile shell. He packed with a grim focus. Each item secured a small victory against the looming monumental task. Their son Gershom wove between their legs, his small face a canvas of bright curiosity. The tension in the tent was a palpable thing, a current he could feel but not understand. He clutched a small carved wooden sheep, a toy he had insisted on bringing. His eyes, wide and unclouded by the weight of prophecy, followed his father's every move. "Is Egypt full of big rivers?" he asked, his voice piping through the hushed seriousness. "Bigger than the well?" Moses paused, a half-filled water skin in his hand. He looked at his son, at the innocent wonder in his eyes, and felt a profound ache. He was leading this child from the only home he had ever known into a land of uncertainty and danger. He tried to form an answer, to describe the vast life-giving Nile, but the words felt inadequate, mere shadows of a reality he himself had not seen in decades. He simply nodded, a tight, weary gesture, and returned to his work. "Will we see the king in his golden house?" Gershom persisted, his imagination already painting grand pictures. "Will he have a crown?" This time Moses flinched, his knuckles whitening around the strap he was tightening. The image of Pharaoh's court, all cold marble and colder hearts, flashed before him. He saw not a golden house for a child's wonder, but a fortress of oppression, a place of judgment and death. He could not bring himself to answer, offering only a strained silence that spoke louder than any warning. Zipporah caught his eye over Gershom's head, her expression a mixture of shared anxiety and gentle reproach. She knelt, drawing their son close, and offered a simple, reassuring explanation about a long walk to see their family, deftly steering his thoughts away from crowns and kings and toward the adventure of the journey itself. As the last bundle was tied and the final waterskin was filled, a heavy silence fell over the small family. They stood amidst the packed supplies, their humble life in Midian reduced to a few carried possessions. The tent, which had been their shelter and their home, now felt like an empty shell. Moses' nervousness was a live thing in his chest, but beneath it, the determination forged in the fire of the burning bush held firm. He looked at his wife, her face set with a brave acceptance, and at his son, trusting and unaware. He hefted his staff, feeling its familiar weight, and knew there was no turning back. They were packed for a trip that would change the world, a family of three stepping out of the quiet desert and into the roaring current of history. Chapter 5. The journey begins. The first step away from the tents of Jethro was the heaviest. It was a step out of a known world, a severing of 40 years of quiet routine. The sun, barely cresting the eastern dunes, cast their long, wavering shadows ahead of them, as if their future selves were already marching toward a destiny they could not yet see. Behind them, the small cluster of Midianite dwellings receded, their familiar outlines softening into the hazy golden distance until they were nothing more than a smudge of memory against the vast, indifferent desert. Moses led the way, his staff striking the hard-packed earth with a firm, deliberate rhythm that was both a proclamation and a prayer. Zipporah walked just behind him, one hand holding a bundle of their supplies, the other clasped firmly around Gershom's small hand. The boy kept turning back, his eyes wide, watching the only home he had ever known disappear into the shimmering heat. The sand beneath their feet was already warm, a fine pale gold that shifted and whispered with every step, swallowing their footprints as soon as they were made. It was as if the desert was conspiring to erase their passage, to pretend they had never been there at all. The air grew hotter as the sun climbed, a dry, baking heat that drew the moisture from their skin and filled their lungs with fire. The horizon was a wavering liquid line, a mirage of endless nothingness broken only by the occasional skeletal outline of a long-dead acacia tree. Moses fixed his gaze on a distant purplish ridge of mountains, a landmark on the route toward Egypt. He used it as a focal point, a tangible goal in a sea of formless sand, but his mind was not on the terrain. With each plodding step, his thoughts churned, a turbulent river flowing backward and forward in time. He remembered the cool, shaded halls of Pharaoh's palace, the scent of incense and power, the face of the man he had killed. The ghost of his past life walked beside him, a silent, accusing companion. How could that man, a fugitive prince, now stand before the most powerful ruler in the world and demand the unthinkable? The voice from the burning bush echoed in his memory, a promise of presence. But the fear was a cold stone in his gut, a visceral counterpoint to the desert's heat. He prayed without words, a raw, desperate plea that was more feeling than thought. He prayed for strength that felt beyond him, for a courage he did not possess, for words that would not stick in his throat. He prayed for the safety of the small, trusting family trailing behind him, for Zipporah's steadfast faith, for Gershom's innocent future. Zipporah matched his pace, her own thoughts a quieter, more practical echo of his fears. She watched the set of his shoulders, the determined angle of his head, and saw the weight he carried. Her faith in him was a quiet flame, but the wind of uncertainty threatened to snuff it out with every gust. She focused on the immediate needs, the amount of water in the skins, the weariness in her son's legs, the relentless glare of the sun. Gershom, after the initial excitement had worn off, had grown quiet, his small face flushed with the heat. He trudged along, his little legs working hard to keep up, his questions for once stilled by the sheer, overwhelming vastness of the wilderness. By midday, the world was a blinding expanse of light and heat. There was no shelter, no respite. They stopped briefly in the scant shadow of a large rock, passing a water skin between them. The water was already warm, but it was life itself. Moses looked at his wife and son, their faces etched with fatigue, and a fresh wave of responsibility, heavier than any pack, settled upon him. He was leading them into this. The journey had only just begun, and the road was long, hot, and fraught with unknown perils. He took up his staff again, its familiar grain a tactile reminder of the promise made at Horeb. The path ahead was scorching, uncertain, and terrifying. But it was the path he had been called to walk. With a silent, renewed prayer for strength he did not feel, Moses turned his face from the shadow of the rock and led his family back out into the blazing open desert toward a future written in fire and sand. Chapter 6. A scary dream. The desert night was a vast black canvas pricked with 1,000,000 cold silver stars. But for Moses, sleep offered no peace, only a deeper, more terrifying darkness. Exhaustion from the day's grueling march pulled him under, but his mind, still churning with fears and prophecies, conjured a landscape more dreadful than the waking wilderness. He dreamed he was back in Egypt, but it was an Egypt twisted by nightmare. The sun-baked bricks of the storage cities of Pithom and Ramses loomed like mountains, their outlines bleeding into a bruised twilight sky. The air, thick with the smell of straw and mud, was also laced with the metallic scent of fear and the coppery tang of blood. He was running, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure panic. Behind him, the earth trembled with a rhythmic, thunderous sound, the synchronized beat of hooves and the relentless roll of chariot wheels. He dared a glance over his shoulder, and his blood ran cold. Pharaoh's army was a wave of polished bronze and gleaming gold, a relentless machine of destruction cresting the horizon. The sun glinted off 1,000 spear points, and the faces of the soldiers were hidden behind grim, expressionless helmets. At their head, in a chariot of electrum pulled by midnight black stallions, was Pharaoh himself. But in the dream, it was not the face of the current king. It was a composite of every ruler Moses had ever known or feared, a face of cold, absolute power, his eyes burning with a hatred that was both personal and divine. The king's arm rose, pointing directly at Moses, a silent command that sent the chariot surging forward with a deafening roar. Moses ran, his legs heavy as stone, his breath tearing from his lungs in ragged gasps. The sand, which had been soft and yielding during the day, was now a clinging mire, sucking at his feet, holding him back. He could hear the snorting of the horses, the crack of whips, the jeering shouts of the soldiers closing in. He was alone, utterly alone. Zipporah and Gershom were nowhere to be seen. The staff he clutched was just a dead piece of wood. powerless. The promise of the burning bush felt like a cruel joke, a whisper drowned out by the thunder of his impending doom. A chariot wheel brushed his heel, and he stumbled, falling face first into the sand. The shadow of the king's chariot fell over him, cold and final. He woke with a strangled cry, bolting upright on his sleeping mat. The cold sweat of terror drenched his tunic, and his entire body trembled uncontrollably. The peaceful silence of the desert night was a shocking contrast to the cacophony of his dream. He gasped for air, his eyes wide, still seeing the gleam of bronze and the cold eyes of the king. Zipporah was awake in an instant, her hand finding his arm in the darkness. She felt the violent tremor running through him, saw the stark terror etched on his face in the faint starlight. She did not ask what was wrong. The ragged, fearful sounds he made were answer enough. She moved closer, wrapping her arms around him, her warmth a solid anchor in the aftermath of the phantom chase. She held him as his breathing slowly steadied, her presence a quiet bulwark against the lingering shadows of the dream. When the worst of the trembling had passed, she began to speak, her voice a soft, steady murmur against the vast silence of the desert. She did not speak of armies or pharaohs. Instead, she told him an old story, a tale passed down through the generations of her people about a small bird caught in a sudden, violent sandstorm. The bird, she said, was terrified, tossed and thrown by the furious wind, unable to see the sun or the earth. It fought with all its might, but its strength was nothing against the storm. Finally, exhausted and certain of its end, it simply stopped fighting. It folded its wings and fell, not in surrender, but in trust. And as it fell, it dropped below the fiercest winds, finding a pocket of calm air close to the ground, where it landed safely in the lee of a great rock. The story was simple, its meaning profound. It was a story about the futility of relying on one's own strength and the paradoxical power of faith, of letting go and trusting in a protection greater than oneself. She spoke of the same faithfulness that guided the stars in their courses and brought water from the rock, a faithfulness that would not abandon them on the road to which they had been called. Her words were a gentle balm, not erasing the fear, but building a small, warm fire of courage beside it, a light to hold against the chilling memory of the dream. Chapter 7. God's Reminder. The sun rose on their third day of travel, a molten gold coin burning away the last vestiges of night's chill and the lingering dread of Moses' dream. They walked in a silence that felt heavier than the packs they carried, the vast, empty landscape offering no distraction from the weight of their mission. The desert here was a place of stark, sweeping beauty, a kingdom of sand and sky where a man's soul felt both exposed and insignificant. Moses led them through a wide, flat wadi, its floor a mosaic of cracked, pale clay and scattered sun-bleached stones. His mind was a tangle of remembered chariots and the quiet comfort of Zipporah's story, the fear and the faith warring within him like two opposing winds. Then, without warning, the world changed. It began as a faint shimmer in the air ahead, a distortion in the heat haze that quickly intensified. The light gathered, coalescing from the very fabric of the atmosphere, pulling itself into a single, concentrated point of brilliance. It was not the gentle glow of dawn, nor the harsh glare of the midday sun. This was a light of a different order, a pure, searing whiteness that held the clarity of diamond and the power of a star fallen to earth. It erupted silently in the space before them, a pillar of radiance so intense that Moses threw up a hand to shield his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. The light did not illuminate. It became illumination, swallowing the shadows and painting the barren wadi in tones of liquid silver. It pulsed with a slow, majestic rhythm, a visual heartbeat that resonated in the core of Moses' being. Zipporah gasped softly, pulling Gershom close against her legs. The boy stared, his mouth agape, not in fear, but in wonder at the sheer impossible beauty of it. The light held no heat, only a profound, awe-inspiring presence. It was a sign, unmistakable and divine, a silent shout in the emptiness of the desert. And as Moses stood transfixed, the memory the light evoked was not of burning bushes or commanding voices, but of older stories, tales whispered in the courts of Egypt and around the campfires of his own people. It spoke directly to his spirit, a wordless reminder of a promise made centuries before to a man named Abraham. The light seemed to echo with the ghost of that ancient covenant, the promise of descendants as numerous as the stars above their heads, of a land to call their own, of a blessing that would extend to all nations. It was a reminder of a faithfulness that spanned generations, a plan set in motion long before Moses had drawn his first breath. The brilliance was a direct line to that past, a reaffirmation that the God who was leading him to Egypt was the same God who had walked with the patriarchs, the keeper of promises that time could not erode. Yet, as the light began to fade, dissolving back into the ordinary air of the desert as silently as it had come, a deep and profound confusion settled over Moses. He lowered his hand, his eyes seeing spots, his mind reeling. The reminder was clear, but its application to his current trembling reality felt obscure. He understood the covenant, the grand sweeping narrative of a chosen people and a promised land. But what did that have to do with him, here and now, a man leading his family through a wilderness haunted by nightmares and his own inadequacy? The promise to Abraham was a mountain. His own fears were a grain of sand. How was he, with his slow speech and his history of failure, supposed to be the bridge between that ancient starry pledge and its fulfillment? The divine light had illuminated the promise, but it had also cast the shadow of his own insufficiency into even sharper relief. He felt like a single, flawed instrument being asked to play a symphony written for the ages, and the dissonance within him was a painful, bewildering clamor. The path ahead still stretched toward Egypt, but now it was paved not only with sand and fear, but with the weight of a centuries-old covenant that he could not fully comprehend. Chapter 8. Crossing the River. The river appeared as a sudden, impossible wound of blue and green slashed across the tawny skin of the desert. For days, their world had been a monochrome of sand and rock, their eyes starved for any color other than the pale gold of the earth and the hard, brilliant blue of the sky. The sight of the water, wide and swift-moving, was both a blessing and a formidable barrier. It was not a gentle stream, but a powerful, churning force, its brown, silt-laden current carving a deep channel between steep, crumbling banks. The far shore seemed a world away, a hazy line of desolation that promised only more of the same arduous journey. The sound of the river was a low, constant roar, a voice of nature that spoke of depth and power and danger. Moses stood at the water's edge, the fine spray cooling his sun-baked face. The staff felt heavy in his hand. its purpose here unclear. He could not part these waters. This was not the reed sea of future legend, but a simple, earthly river that demanded an earthly solution. He looked at the rushing current, at the way it snatched at branches and debris, carrying them away with an indifferent strength, and felt the old familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He was a shepherd, not a boatman. The task of getting his family across felt as monumental as confronting Pharaoh. Yet, as he turned to look at Zipporah and Gershom, he saw not despair, but a quiet, practical resolve. Zipporah was already scanning the banks, her eyes assessing the materials the river had to offer. She pointed to a stand of dead tamarisk trees, their trunks bleached white and skeletal, further up the bank. Gershom, his fear of the water forgotten in the excitement of a new challenge, began gathering lengths of dry, tough vine that snaked through the scrubby undergrowth. Their unspoken faith in his leadership, their immediate assumption that a way would be found, shamed his moment of doubt. The crossing was not his burden alone to bear. It was a task for the family. The work was hard and messy. The sun beat down at their backs as they dragged the heavy, unwieldy logs to a flat area near the bank. Moses used a sharp-edged stone to hack away stubborn branches, his muscles aching with the unfamiliar labor. Zipporah worked with a nimble strength, weaving the pliable vines through and around the logs, pulling them taut to bind the structure together. Her knots were secure, born of a life of practical necessity. Gershom scurried back and forth, bringing smaller sticks to plug the gaps, his small face screwed up in concentration. They worked in a harmony that needed no words, the roar of the river their only soundtrack. Sweat stung their eyes, and the rough wood scraped their hands, but with each vine tied and each log secured, the chaotic pile of timber began to take shape, transforming into a crude but serviceable raft. As he lashed the final log into place, Moses paused, his hands resting on the rough, sun-warmed wood. He looked at what they had built together, a fragile vessel of faith cobbled together from the desert's refuse. It was not a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It was clumsy and sat low in the shallows, taking on water almost immediately. It was a testament not to their skill, but to their collective will. And in that moment, staring at the raft that represented their shared effort and hope, the lesson of the river became clear. The burning bush had called him. The dream had terrified him. The light had reminded him of the covenant. But this simple, physical act of building was about trust. He had to trust the strength of the vines his son had gathered. He had to trust the stability of the logs his wife had chosen. And on a level far deeper, he had to trust that the same God who had spoken from the fire would guide this clumsy human effort across the powerful, indifferent current. He could build the raft, but he could not command the river. His role was to steer, to persevere, and to have faith that they would reach the other side. Taking a deep breath, Moses pushed the completed raft fully into the water, holding it steady against the pull of the current. He helped Zipporah and a wide-eyed Gershom aboard, then climbed on himself, his weight causing the raft to sink alarmingly low. He took up the long pole he had fashioned, planted it in the riverbed, and pushed. The current grabbed them immediately, but Moses leaned into the pole, his muscles straining, his entire being focused on the far shore. He was not just crossing a river. He was crossing a threshold of faith, learning to trust not only in the divine promise, but in the path itself, one hard-won, precarious foot at a time. Chapter 9. Gershom's Questions. The far shore of the river was not a destination, but merely a continuation of the desert's harsh embrace. The raft, their temporary vessel of salvation, was now a forgotten heap of sodden timber, already being pulled apart by the relentless current. They stood on the bank, their clothes clinging to them, dripping pools of water onto the thirsty sand. The exertion of the crossing had left them breathless, but it was a clean tiredness, the fatigue of a challenge met and overcome. For a few moments there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant roar of the river, a sound that was already fading behind them, a barrier they had conquered. It was Gershom who broke the silence, his young mind, unburdened by the physical strain, already leaping ahead to the mysteries that lay before them. He tugged at the hem of his father's damp tunic, his small face tilted upward, his eyes bright with a curiosity that the wearying journey had not dimmed. "Father," he began, his voice a small, clear bell in the vast quiet, "why are we going to Egypt?" The question, so simple and direct, hung in the air between them. Moses looked down at his son, at the trust and innocence in his gaze, and felt the immense, complicated weight of the answer settle upon him. How could he explain the politics of gods and kings to a child? How could he convey the centuries of suffering, the divine fury, the terrifying weight of a prophetic call? He knelt, bringing himself to Gershom's level, the wet sand soaking through the knees of his robe. He sought words that would build a bridge between his son's small world and the colossal drama they were entering. He began with people, because a child understands people. He spoke of their family, a family Gershom had never met. He described a vast tribe, their own blood, living far away in a land of great stone buildings and a mighty river. But he painted the picture with darker hues, explaining how these relatives were not free. He spoke of slavery, not with the complex language of oppression, but with the simple, brutal imagery a child could grasp. He told Gershom of people forced to work all day under the hot sun, making bricks from mud and straw, their backs aching, their spirits bowed by harsh masters who carried whips. He described the sadness in their hearts, a deep, collective sorrow that had lasted for generations. Seeing the distress cloud his son's face, Moses quickly moved to the hope. His voice softened, taking on a reverent tone as he spoke of a promise. He told Gershom of a great and powerful God, the God of their ancestors, who had seen the suffering of his people and had heard their cries. He described this God as a hero from an old story, one who was mighty and full of compassion, who had made a solemn vow to rescue them. He spoke of a land that had been promised to them, a good land, rich with fields of grain and vineyards heavy with fruit, a place where they could be free and happy, where families could live without fear. Gershom listened, his imagination caught by the epic struggle, the sad slaves, the listening hero God, the beautiful promised land. It was a story of good and evil, of rescue and reward, and it made a certain satisfying sense to him. He nodded, his small brow furrowed in thought, trying to fit this grand narrative into the reality of his own long, hot walk. But as Moses rose to his feet, his explanation complete, a cold, subtle dread whispered at the edge of his consciousness. He had told the story of the promise, But he had left out a crucial, bloody detail. He had spoken of the covenant of land and descendants, but he had completely forgotten the sign of that covenant, the physical mark of belonging. That was its seal. The memory of the fiery light, the reminder of the Abrahamic covenant flashed in his mind, but the connection remained frayed, the specific command buried under the weight of his larger fears. The instruction about circumcision, the intimate, painful rite that was the prerequisite for the very deliverance he was proclaiming, did not cross his lips. It was an omission, born not of defiance, but of a mind overwhelmed by the scale of his mission, a critical piece of the divine instruction lost in the chasm between the blazing theophany at Horeb and the practical, fearful heart of the man tasked with its fulfillment. He had given his son the story of liberation, but he had withheld the key to its safe passage. Chapter 10. Zipporah's Worry. The desert had a way of revealing truths that a man tried to bury in the deep, silent places of his heart. As the days stretched on, a heat-hazed procession of sun-scorched miles, Zipporah watched her husband with the keen, perceptive eyes of one who had shared his life and his tent for years. She saw the determined set of his jaw as he led them forward, the way his grip on the staff never slackened, the unwavering line he walked toward the distant horizon of Egypt. But she also saw the subtle tremors that ran through him when he thought no one was looking, the way his gaze would grow distant and clouded, fixed on some internal horizon of dread. He was a man walking in two worlds, his body in the desert, his spirit wrestling with gods and pharaohs. It was in the small, unguarded moments that the cracks showed most clearly. At night, as they huddled around their meager fire, the flames would catch the haunted look in his eyes, a reflection of some terror she could not see. He would startle at ordinary sounds, the scuttle of a desert lizard, the sigh of the wind over a dune, his body tensing as if expecting the thunder of chariots. When Gershom asked his simple, earnest questions, Moses' answers were often too sharp, too hurried, or he would fall into a heavy silence, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, grappling with a burden he would not or could not share. He had told her of the burning bush, of God's command, of the promise of deliverance. But now there was a new layer to his anxiety, a furtive, skittish quality that felt different from the fear of the task itself. It was the fear of a man keeping a secret. A cold knot of worry tightened in Zipporah's stomach, coiling with every evasive glance, every strained silence. What was he hiding? Had God given him another more terrible command he was afraid to speak aloud? Did it concern their son? The memory of Gershom's confused face after his father's abrupt answers was a fresh pang of maternal fear. Was the danger to their child greater than she had imagined? Her mind conjured dark possibilities. A sacrifice demanded, a fate worse than slavery, a divine wrath that would consume the innocent along with the guilty. The trust that had been the bedrock of their marriage now felt like ground shifting beneath her feet. The man she had followed into this wilderness was becoming a stranger, haunted by a silence that screamed louder than the desert wind. One afternoon, as Moses scouted a path ahead, his figure a solitary, tense silhouette against the blazing sky, Zipporah found a moment of solitude. She sent Gershom to collect some of the dry, thorny brush for their evening fire, and when he was safely out of earshot, she sank to her knees in the sand. The grains were hot. even through the fabric of her robe, a grounding, physical sensation in a world that felt increasingly unmoored. She bowed her head, the sun a weight on her back. Her prayer was not a grand, eloquent petition. It was a raw, silent cry from the depths of a wife's and a mother's heart. She did not ask for the deliverance of a nation or for the strength to confront a king. Her plea was smaller, more intimate, and infinitely more desperate. She prayed for the man she loved, that whatever shadow lay upon his soul would be lifted, that he would find the courage to share his burden. She prayed for their son, for his safety, for the preservation of his innocence in the face of the terrifying destiny that stalked them. She prayed for their small, vulnerable family, a tiny ark of love adrift in a vast hostile ocean of sand and prophecy. She asked for a hedge of protection to be built around them, not from the physical perils of the desert, but from the unseen spiritual dangers that seemed to be closing in, whispering through her husband's silence. She poured her fear and her faith into the silent, listening emptiness, trusting that the God who spoke from fire would also hear the whispered terror of a woman afraid for her family. Chapter 11. The dark night. The sun bled out across the western sky, its final defiant rays painting the barren landscape in shades of bruised purple and dying orange. They made camp in a place of bones and shadows, a rocky depression littered with sharp black stones that looked like the scattered teeth of some long-dead leviathan. There was no soft sand here, no gentle slope to ease their weary bodies. They settled in the lee of a large fractured boulder, its surface scarred by wind and time, offering meager protection from the gathering chill of the night. The air itself felt different here, heavier, thicker, as if the darkness had a tangible weight that pressed down upon the chest and made each breath a conscious effort. A profound silence, deeper than the mere absence of sound, blanketed the area, a listening quiet that seemed to absorb the very thought of noise. Moses helped Zipporah arrange their thin blankets on the hard, uneven ground. Gershom, exhausted from the day's march, fell into a fitful sleep almost immediately, his small form curled tightly against the cold. Zipporah soon followed, her breathing evening out into the soft, regular rhythm of slumber. But for Moses, sleep was a distant country, its borders barred by the sentinels of his own restless mind. He lay on his back, staring up at the hard, bright chips of stars scattered across the velvet blackness of the sky. The familiar constellations, which usually offered a map of cosmic constancy, now seemed cold and indifferent, their patterns a mockery of his earthly turmoil. It was not the usual fears that kept him awake tonight, not the memory of Pharaoh's face, nor the daunting scale of his mission. This was something else, something more primal and immediate. A heavy, oppressive presence seemed to saturate the very air around their small camp. It was a feeling of being watched, not by human eyes, but by something vast, ancient, and intensely focused. The darkness between the rocks felt alive, pooling and shifting with a malevolent consciousness. Every rustle of a night insect, every faint crack of the cooling stones sounded like a footfall, a deliberate approach. He felt a cold dread, a sensation of icy fingers tracing a path down his spine that had nothing to do with the desert night's chill. His senses, honed by decades in the wilderness, screamed that something was profoundly wrong. This was not the awe-inspiring presence of the burning bush, nor the reassuring reminder of the celestial light. This was a predatory stillness, a waiting anger that gathered in the shadows just beyond the faint, dying embers of their fire. He lay perfectly still, every muscle taut, his ears straining against the silence, his heart pounding a frantic, trapped rhythm against his ribs. The night was no longer a time of rest, but a domain of unseen peril, and he was its sole wakeful witness, paralyzed by a certainty that some terrible reckoning was drawing near. Chapter 12. God's Anger. The darkness did not merely linger, it congealed. The air, already thick with a sense of foreboding, grew so heavy it felt difficult to draw breath, each inhalation a struggle against an invisible, suffocating weight. The stars above, once sharp and clear, began to dim as if a vast unseen hand were smothering their light one by one, pulling a shroud of absolute blackness over the rocky basin. The silence was no longer empty. It was a listening, waiting silence, charged with a terrifying potential, like the moment between the lightning flash and the thunderclap. Moses lay rigid on his blanket, his body a tightly coiled spring of dread. The oppressive presence he had felt earlier was no longer a suspicion at the edge of his awareness. It was now the entire reality of the world, a palpable force that pressed down upon him, demanding acknowledgment. Then the temperature plummeted. A cold that had nothing to do with the desert night swept through the camp, a deep spiritual frost that made the air itself seem to crackle. The few remaining embers of their fire winked out instantly, not in a puff of smoke, but as if their very essence had been extinguished by the cold. From the heart of the impenetrable darkness in front of Moses, a form began to manifest. It was not a shape of light, but a shape of deeper, more absolute night, a silhouette of pure void that hurt the eyes to look upon. It had the vague outline of a man, but one of impossible scale and terror, its edges bleeding into the surrounding blackness. There were no features, only a sense of overwhelming, focused intent, a consciousness of such immense power and holiness that it burned with a cold, righteous fire. This was not the God of the burning bush who spoke with patient if firm command. This was the God of the covenant, the enforcer of oaths, and his attention was fixed on Moses with the ferocity of a consuming flame. The reason for this divine wrath was a gaping void in Moses' obedience, a single critical command from the covenant with Abraham that he had neglected. He had been charged with leading God's firstborn son, Israel, out of Egypt, but he had failed to ensure the sign of that covenant was upon his own firstborn son, his own household. The omission was not a minor oversight. It was a fundamental breach of the holy agreement, a stain of disobedience that rendered him unfit for the sacred task. The presence radiating from the form was one of pure, unadulterated fury, a holiness so intense that it could not abide the presence of such a flaw in its chosen instrument. The intent was clear, simple, and horrifying: execution. The covenant breaker would be cut off. A wave of paralyzing terror, more absolute than any he had ever known, slammed into Moses. It was not the fear of a man facing a mortal enemy, but the soul-shattering dread of a created being confronted by the full, unveiled wrath of its Creator. His muscles turned to water. His bones felt as if they had dissolved. The breath froze in his lungs. A silent scream lodged in his throat. Unable to find release, the immense, holy pressure of the presence forced him down, flattening him against the unyielding stone. He could not lift his head, could not raise a hand in supplication or defense. He was pinned, utterly helpless, a moth held motionless by the heat of a star. The form of concentrated darkness loomed over him, a manifestation of divine judgment that saw every failing, every moment of doubt, and most of all, the critical act of disobedience he had carried with him from Midian. There was no voice, no pronouncement of sentence, only the silent, crushing weight of a righteous anger that intended to snuff out his life where he lay. He was on the ground, unable to move, trapped between the cold, hard rock and the colder, harder judgment of God, waiting for the final annihilating touch. From the edge of sleep, Zipporah was jolted awake by a silence that screamed. It was not the peaceful quiet of the desert night, but a vacuum, an absence so profound it felt like a physical blow. The air was frigid, a deep, unnatural cold that seeped through her blankets and clutched at her heart. Her gaze flew to her husband, and what she saw rooted her in a terror far colder than the night. Moses was prostrate on the ground, his body pressed flat against the stone as if crushed by an invisible, immense weight. His form was rigid, every muscle locked in a paralysis that was not of this world. He was not sleeping, he was trapped, held in the grip of a presence so holy and so furious it made the very darkness writhe. A form, darker than the deepest shadow, loomed over him. It had no face, no features, only a terrifying outline of absolute power and focused intent. Zipporah's breath caught in her throat, her blood turning to ice in her veins. This was no dream, no phantom of the wilderness. This was divine judgment, a wrath so pure and personal it had found them in this desolate place. Her mind, fogged with sleep and fear, scrambled for understanding. Why? What had he done? What covenant had been broken? What law disobeyed to bring the fury of God upon him here on the very road to fulfilling his command? Her thoughts were a frantic whirlwind, snatching at memories like leaves in a storm. The burning bush, the promise of deliverance, the light that had reminded them of the ancient covenant. The covenant. The word echoed, a key searching for a lock, and then, with the clarity of lightning splitting a midnight sky, the memory surfaced. It was an old story, a foundational law of her husband's people, passed down but never practiced in her Midianite home. The story of Abraham, the covenant sealed not with words alone, but with blood. The sign of the covenant, circumcision. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was not a grand theological failing, not a failure of courage or speech. It was a simple, domestic, bloody omission. Their son, Gershom, he did not bear the mark. He was not sealed into the covenant of the God whose mission his father was to lead. In his focus on the grand narrative of liberation, in the tumult of his fears and the weight of his calling, Moses had forgotten the most intimate, fundamental requirement of his faith. The one who was to lead God's firstborn son out of Egypt had not consecrated his own firstborn son to God. The anger that held her husband pinned to the ground was the righteous fury of a promise broken, a seal left unapplied. The deliverer was unclean, his household outside the covenant, and the holiness of God could not abide it. The life was being pressed from him not for a lack of faith in the mission, but for a failure in the foundational act of obedience that made the mission possible. Her husband was dying for a forgotten ritual, and only she, in this moment of terrifying clarity, held the memory that could save him. Chapter 13. Quick Decision. The knowledge was a cold, sharp stone in Zipporah's gut, a truth so immediate and terrifying it burned away all hesitation. There was no time for prayer, no moment for debate or pleading. The dark form hovering over Moses pulsed with an impatient, lethal energy, the pressure in the air intensifying, threatening to shatter the very stones around them. Her husband's life was measured in heartbeats, each one a fainter echo than the last. The ancient law demanded blood, the blood of the covenant, and it demanded it now. Her eyes, wide and desperate, scanned the rough ground, her mind working with a frantic, lucid speed. She needed a blade, something sharp and swift. There were no polished bronze, knives in their packs, only the crude tools of survival. Her gaze fell upon a dark, flinty stone, half buried near the base of the large boulder. It was jagged, its edge fractured into a cruel, serrated line that caught the faint, residual starlight. She scrambled toward it, her fingers scraping against the unyielding rock as she pried it from the hard-packed earth. It was heavy and cold in her hand, a primitive instrument for a primal rite. Turning, she moved to where Gershom lay, still locked in the innocent, untroubled sleep of childhood, unaware of the divine storm raging just feet away. Her heart clenched, a fierce, protective agony tearing through her. To wake him to this, to the pain and the fear and the bewildering violence of the act, felt like a betrayal of every maternal instinct. But to do nothing was to betray him more profoundly. It was to let his father die, to leave him orphaned in this wasteland, his future extinguished by a forgotten command. There was no choice. The covenant required the sign, and the sign required blood. She knelt beside him, her movement swift and sure, a strange, grim calm descending upon her. There was no room for gentleness, only for necessity. She shook him awake, her touch firm. His eyes fluttered open, confusion and the beginnings of fear clouding his face as he saw the stark terror in hers. She did not speak, could not form words to explain the inexplicable. Her expression, a mask of fierce love and desperate resolve, was the only communication he needed. She held the flint rock firmly, its rough edges digging into her palm. There was a moment of blinding, heart-stopping tension, a silent plea for forgiveness in her eyes, and then she acted. With a single, decisive motion, born of a courage that defied the trembling in her own soul, she performed the rite. It was swift, a flash of searing pain and shock for the boy, a gush of hot blood upon the cold stone. A sharp cry was stifled against her shoulder as she held him close, her own tears mingling with his, her body a shield against the terror of the night. The deed was done, the forgotten sign was given. The blood of the covenant, the price of obedience, was spilled onto the desert floor. Chapter 14, The Relief. The moment the blood touched the stone, the world shifted. The suffocating pressure that had pinned Moses to the ground vanished as if it had never been. The air, which had been thick with the promise of death, suddenly felt light and breathable again. The paralyzing terror that had held him in its icy grip released him, leaving behind a trembling, sweat-soaked weakness. He drew in a ragged, shuddering gasp, his lungs burning with the shock of the returned freedom. The form of concentrated darkness, the manifestation of God's wrath, simply dissolved, not fading, but ceasing to exist, its terrifying presence withdrawing from their small camp as swiftly and silently as it had come. The stars overhead seemed to brighten, their light no longer smothered, and the ordinary sounds of the desert night, the whisper of the wind, the chirp of a distant cricket, tentatively returned, a symphony of normalcy after the silence of judgment. Zipporah, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands and robe stained, did not pause to comfort her sobbing son. The act was complete, but the ritual demanded a conclusion, a declaration to the retreating presence. Her movements were swift, driven by a primal understanding of the covenant's demands. She scooped up the sharp, bloodied flint stone, its surface now sacred with the price of her husband's life. Stumbling to where Moses lay, still dazed and struggling to comprehend his deliverance, she knelt before him, her eyes, wide with a mixture of horror and fierce triumph, met his confused gaze. Without a word, she reached out and touched the rough, blood-smeared stone to his feet. The gesture was rich with symbolic meaning. By touching the blood, the sign of the fulfilled covenant, to the feet of the deliverer, she was proclaiming that the breach had been sealed, the price had been paid. The one who was to walk into Egypt and lead God's people to freedom was now himself covered by the blood of the covenant. He was no longer an unclean vessel, but a consecrated one. The blood on the stone was a stark, physical testimony to her quick, brave obedience, an act that had stood in the gap between her husband's failure and God's righteous demand. As the cold, bloody stone made contact with his skin, a final, palpable wave of release passed over Moses. The last vestige of the divine anger lifted, leaving behind only the cool night air and the profound, trembling relief of a sentence commuted. The God who had come to kill had now departed, his covenant satisfied, his chosen instrument spared. They were alone again, just a family in the desert, but the space around them was no longer filled with wrath, only with the stark, sobering aftermath of a grace bought with blood and courage. Chapter 15. After the fear, for a long moment, the three of them existed in a state of suspended animation, the echoes of the divine storm still vibrating in the air around them. The terrible pressure was gone, the chilling presence had vanished, but the memory of it was seared into their souls, a brand of terror and awe. Then, as if a single string had been cut, they collapsed toward one another. Moses, his limbs still weak and trembling from the paralysis of holy fear, reached for Zipporah, his hands clutching at her shoulders as if she were the only solid thing in a reeling universe. She fell into his embrace, her own body shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline and the visceral memory of the flint stone in her hand, the feel of it, the weight of its terrible necessity. Gershom, confused and crying from the sudden shocking pain, pressed himself between them, his small frame seeking the familiar shelter of their bodies. They wrapped their arms around him, around each other, forming a tight, trembling knot of humanity in the vast, indifferent darkness. No words were spoken, none were possible. The only sounds were the ragged, shuddering draws of breath and the soft, choked sobs of a relief so profound it was indistinguishable from grief. Moses buried his face in his wife's hair, his own tears hot and silent, washing away the cold sweat of terror. They were tears for the fear he had felt, for the life that had been so narrowly snatched back from the brink, and for the shocking, brutal cost of that salvation. He held his son, feeling the boy's small body tremble against his chest, and a fresh wave of anguish washed over him. Anguish for the pain he had indirectly caused, for the innocence that had been so violently breached. As the initial storm of emotion began to subside, leaving behind a raw, hollowed-out calm, Moses pulled back just enough to look at Zipporah. In the returning starlight, he saw her face, pale, streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes dark pools of exhaustion and a hard-won resolve. He saw the blood on her hands, a dark, accusing stain against her skin, and on the hem of her robe. The full, devastating understanding of what had transpired crashed over him. His failure, his critical, damning omission had brought the wrath of God upon them, and her quickness, her courage, her unwavering grasp of a law he had forgotten had been their deliverance. His voice, when it finally came, was a hoarse, broken whisper, scraped raw from the silence of his terror. It was not a speech, not an explanation, but a raw, unfiltered outpouring of gratitude and shame. He thanked her, the words simple and heavy with the weight of his debt. He thanked her for her life, for his life, for the preservation of their family, and in that gratitude, the understanding of his own failure crystallized with painful, absolute clarity. He had been so focused on the grand scope of the calling, the confrontation with Pharaoh, the liberation of a nation, that he had neglected the foundational, intimate obedience required to even begin the task. He had heard the voice from the burning bush, but he had only partially listened. He had accepted the mission, but had disregarded the conditions of the covenant that made the mission possible. His mistake was not a lack of faith in the promise, but a failure in the precise personal practice of that faith. The command had been clear, and he had not obeyed fully. He had carried the word of God in his heart, but had left the sign of God off his own son's body. The lesson was written not on stone tablets, but in the blood on the ground and on the hands of his wife. A leader must follow the rules most meticulously of all, for his failures do not merely affect him, but endanger everyone entrusted to his care. He held his family close, the reality of his narrow escape, and the reason for it, settling deep into his bones, a humbling, terrifying, and transformative knowledge. Chapter 16. Talking It Over. The fire was a small, defiant eye of orange in the immense, star-dusted blackness of the desert night. Its warmth was a tangible comfort, a barrier against the memory of the unnatural cold that had so recently threatened to freeze the very life from their veins. Gershom, exhausted by pain and fear, had finally fallen into a deep, untroubled sleep, swaddled in blankets and cushioned by his mother's lap. Zipporah sat beside him, her fingers gently stroking his hair, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Moses sat opposite them, the firelight carving deep lines of fatigue and contemplation into his face. The silence between them was no longer heavy with dread, but filled with the unspoken weight of what they had endured. The terror had passed, but the need to understand it remained, a quiet urgency that finally drew words from Moses. His voice was low, a rough murmur that blended with the soft crackle of the fire. He did not speak of chariots or pharaohs, of staffs turning to serpents or promises of milk and honey. He spoke of the presence, the form of absolute darkness that had pressed him into the stone. He tried to articulate the quality of that anger, a holiness so pure it could not tolerate the slightest stain of disobedience. It was not the petulant fury of a man, but the righteous, necessary wrath of a God whose covenants were the bedrock of creation itself. He had felt, in those paralyzed moments, the fundamental truth that to be in the presence of such holiness, while in a state of disobedience, was to court annihilation. Zipporah listened, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She had been the one to act, her hands the instrument of their salvation, but she had not fully understood the theological abyss into which they had peered. As Moses spoke, the pieces fell into place. It was not about the journey or the mission or even Moses' personal faith. It was about the covenant, the ancient binding agreement that defined the relationship between God and his people. The sign of that covenant was not a suggestion or a tradition. It was the non-negotiable mark of belonging, the key that unlocked the promise. By neglecting it, Moses had, in effect, attempted to undertake a holy task while standing outside the circle of holiness himself. He was like a man trying to carry a sacred object with unclean hands. Moses stared into the heart of the fire, seeing not its comforting glow, but the memory of the bush that had not been consumed. That fire had been a call. The fire of God's anger had been a consequence. The two were inextricably linked. The God who called was also the God who demanded obedience. The realization settled upon him with the weight of a mountain. A leader, he understood now, was not exempt from the rules. In fact, a leader was bound by them more stringently than anyone else. His failures were not private affairs. They rippled outward, endangering his family, his mission, and the people he was meant to serve. His authority did not place him above the law. It obligated him to be its most scrupulous follower. To lead God's people, he first had to be fully, unequivocally one of them, marked by the same covenant and subject to the same commands. The flintstone and the blood were not just symbols of his rescue, but the stark, indelible lesson of his leadership, that the path to liberation was paved with precise, unwavering obedience, starting in his own tent with his own son. The fire before him was just a fire, but the lesson it illuminated would burn within him forever. Chapter 17. A new start. The dawn that broke over the desert was not merely a change of light, but a cleansing. The first rays of sun, pale and tentative, seemed to wash the lingering stain of terror from the air, painting the rocky basin in soft hues of rose and gold. The memory of the dark night was a scar upon their souls, but the new day felt like a balm, an unspoken promise of a second chance. As they packed their few belongings, their movements were slower, more deliberate, infused with a quiet solemnity that had not been there before. The frantic energy of the initial departure from Midian was gone, replaced by a deep, resolute calm. Moses rolled his blanket with careful hands, his gaze occasionally drifting to his son, who moved with a slight, tender caution, a silent reminder of the price that had been paid for their continued journey. There was no laughter, no childish questions, only a shared, sober understanding that they walked by a grace that was as severe as it was merciful. When they set out, the rhythm of their travel was different. Moses still led, his staff striking the earth, but the sound was not one of grim determination. It was the steady beat of a man walking a consecrated path, a path he now understood was defined not only by its glorious destination, but by the strictures of the journey itself. He no longer walked ahead, lost in the chasm between his fears and the prophecy. He walked beside his family, his presence a tangible shield, his attention fully engaged with the present moment, the firmness of the ground underfoot, the quality of the light, the well-being of his wife and son. He had been humbled to the dust, and from that dust a new kind of strength was rising, one forged in the acknowledgment of his own fallibility and the profound cost of obedience. Zipporah matched his pace, her own spirit quieter, her fierce maternal anxiety tempered by the hard-won knowledge that their safety resided not in her vigilance alone, but in their collective fidelity to the covenant. She watched her husband, seeing not the haunted, secretive man of the previous days, but a leader who had stared into the heart of divine holiness and been refined by its fire. The trust between them, momentarily fractured by his silence, had been reforged in the crucible of that terrible night, stronger and more resilient than before. As the sun climbed higher, warming the sand and painting the world in its familiar harsh light, Moses felt a shift within himself. The awe of the burning bush, the terror of the dream, the confusion of the celestial light, and the paralyzing fear of God's anger, all these experiences coalesced into a single, crystalline point of understanding. Faith was not a vague feeling of hope. It was the active, precise alignment of one's will with the divine command. It was built not on grand gestures, but on the small, bloody, necessary acts of obedience performed in the darkness of a desert night. With each step away from the place of judgment, a silent vow solidified in his heart, a promise etched not on stone, but on his very soul. He would remember. He would remember the voice from the fire, the promise of presence, the weight of the covenant, and the searing lesson of the flint stone. He would remember that to lead was first to follow, to speak for God was first to listen, and to wield divine power was first to submit to divine law. The staff in his hand was no longer just a symbol of a call, it was a reminder of a debt, a tool that would only be powerful in the hands of a man who had promised with every fiber of his being to always remember God's commands. The road to Egypt still stretched before them, long and fraught with peril, but Moses now walked it with a faith that had been tested in the fire of wrath and had emerged not broken, but remade. Chapter 18. Meeting Aaron, the landscape began to soften, the jagged, unforgiving rocks giving way to scattered clumps of tough, dry grass and the occasional stunted acacia tree. They were approaching the fringes of the wilderness, the air carrying a faint, different scent, a hint of moisture, of distant vegetation, of a world less brutally austere than the one they had traversed. Moses led them toward a specific, preordained location, a place whose name had been whispered to his spirit during the long, silent stretches of their journey. It was a small, natural amphitheater of rust-colored stone, a sheltered bowl where a seep of water created a patch of stubborn green amidst the prevailing gold. As they descended the gentle slope into the basin, a figure detached itself from the shadow of the largest rock rising to its feet. The man was older than Moses remembered, his beard streaked with gray, his shoulders slightly stooped with the weight of years and hard labor. But the eyes were the same as the mother they had shared, the same that had looked upon Moses in the palaces of Egypt with a mixture of awe and brotherly affection before the great chasm of their lives had been carved. It was Aaron. He stood waiting, his posture not one of impatience, but of a quiet, watchful readiness, as if he had been standing in that exact spot for days, perhaps weeks, trusting in the timing of a promise he did not fully understand. Recognition was instantaneous and profound. A lifetime of separation, of divergent paths, one into the heart of Egyptian power, the other into the heart of Israelite suffering, collapsed in that single, silent moment. Moses stopped walking, his staff sinking into the soft earth at the center of the basin. Aaron's gaze swept over the small, travel-worn family, the determined, weathered face of his brother, the strong, quiet woman beside him, the young boy peering out from behind her robes with wide, curious eyes. There was no hesitation, no formal greeting. A slow, wondrous smile broke across Aaron's face, erasing the lines of care and age, transforming him back into the brother Moses had known. He closed the distance between them in a few long strides, his own arms opening wide. The embrace was wordless, a communication deeper than language. It was the clasp of shared blood, of a history that predated princes and slaves, of a bond that 40 years of desert and oppression had not severed. Moses felt the solid, real strength of his brother's arms, the thump of a heart beating in a rhythm he had known since childhood. The loneliness that had been his constant companion in Midian, the feeling of being an eternal outsider, fractured and fell away in that embrace. He was not alone. The burden was not his to carry by himself. Aaron held him tightly, his own emotions a turbulent mix of joy, relief, and awe. The brother he had thought lost to the privileges and perils of an Egyptian court was here, returned from the wilderness, marked by a purpose that shone from his eyes with an unsettling, holy light. He was happy, profoundly, and simply happy to see him, and in that happiness was a ready, unspoken vow. He was here to help. Whatever this was, wherever it led, they would face it together. Chapter 19, sharing the story, the fire crackled between them, a small contained echo of the divine blaze that had set this entire journey in motion. The initial joyful reunion had settled into a quiet, watchful calm. Gershom slept, curled in his mother's lap, the traumatic events of the previous nights buried in the deep, healing well of a child's slumber. Zipporah sat nearby, her presence a steady, grounding force, her eyes occasionally meeting Moses's, offering silent strength. Aaron waited, his face a mixture of eager curiosity and deep concern. He had seen the new gravity in his brother's eyes, a weight that went beyond the fatigue of a long journey. He sensed a story waiting to be told, one that would explain the haunted reverence that clung to Moses like a second skin. Moses drew a long, slow breath, the desert air tasting of smoke and memory. He began, not with the bush, but with the emptiness that had preceded it, the decades of tending sheep, the crushing sense of a life lived in the shadow of a forgotten purpose, the loneliness that had been his constant companion in Midian. He painted a picture of a man hollowed out, a vessel waiting to be filled. Then he spoke of Horeb, the mountain of God. His voice grew softer, more resonant, as he described the impossible sight. The bush that burned with a fierce, untamed fire, yet remained utterly unconsumed, every leaf and thorn etched in brilliant, living flame. He spoke of the curiosity that had drawn him near, the awe that had held him captive, and then the voice. He described it not as a sound, but as a vibration that had shaken the foundations of his soul, a voice that knew him, truly knew him, and had called him by name. Aaron listened, his own breath stilled, his food forgotten in his hands. He heard of the divine proclamation, the God of their fathers declaring his intention to free Israel from its bondage. He heard the impossible command given to his brother to go to Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and demand the release of a nation. He heard Moses' own protests, the litany of fear and inadequacy, the slow speech, the forgotten crime, the sheer absurdity of the task, and he heard the answers, each one a testament to a power that dwarfed human limitation, the promise of divine presence, the name I am, the staff that became a serpent and was restored, the hand that was made leprous and then whole. The story unfolded like a tapestry woven with threads of fire and faith, a narrative so grand and terrifying it seemed to suck the air from their small campsite. But Moses did not stop with the glory of the call. His voice grew heavier, the words coming more slowly, as he led his brother into the darker, more recent chapters of their journey. He spoke of the oppressive presence that had fallen upon their camp, the form of absolute darkness that had pinned him to the ground with an intent to kill. He confessed his own critical failure, the forgotten command of the covenant, the omission that had nearly cost him his life and had brought the wrath of God upon his own family. He described Zipporah's swift, terrifying courage, the flash of the flintstone, the blood of the covenant spilled onto the desert floor to save him. He spoke of the relief, the crushing weight of its own shame, and the hard, searing lesson learned in the aftermath, that a leader must follow the rules most meticulously of all. When he finally fell silent, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the vast whispering silence of the desert night. Aaron sat motionless, his face pale in the flickering light. The story was more shocking, more raw, and more holy than anything he could have imagined. It was not a tale of easy triumph, but a testament of terrifying grace and severe mercy. He looked from Moses' weary, resolute face to Zipporah's calm, stained hands, and then to the sleeping form of his nephew. The shock of it all was a physical sensation, a cold tremor that ran through him. This was not a political rebellion, it was a divine collision, and his brother was at its epicenter. He slowly nodded, the initial shock giving way to a dawning, sober understanding. The story, in all its terrifying facets, illuminated a truth as stark as the desert sun. Obedience was not a minor detail in the plan of God. It was the very foundation upon which everything else was built. The power to confront kings and part seas was meaningless without the precise personal submission to the covenant that authorized it. Aaron's agreement was quiet, a solemn acceptance of a reality far more demanding and far more sacred than he had ever dreamed. Chapter 20. Planning together, the fire had burned low, its embers pulsing like a tired heart in the deep desert night. The immensity of the story Moses had shared settled over the small camp, a weight of holy history that seemed to make the very stars above press closer. Sleep was unthinkable. The path ahead, once a vague and terrifying specter, now had a name and a face. Pharaoh. The command was clear, but the method remained a terrifying mystery. How does a man, even one chosen by God, walk into the lion's den and demand its teeth be pulled? The answer, Moses realized with a dawning clarity, was not to be found in solitary brooding, but in preparation. He looked at his brother, Aaron, whose face still held the awe of the divine narrative, and saw not just a companion, but a partner. They moved a little away from the sleeping forms of Zipporah and Gershom, finding a flat, sandy area illuminated by the faint glow of the coals and the sharp white light of the moon. The desert at night was a world of silver and shadow, a vast, silent auditorium for their rehearsal. Moses stood, leaning on his staff, the familiar grain of the wood a tangible link to the power that had transformed it. Aaron faced him, his posture expectant, ready to be molded into the spokesman he he had been promised he would be. Moses began, his voice a low murmur that blended with the whisper of the night wind. He did not speak as a brother, but as a prophet channeling a divine decree. He painted the scene, the colossal pillared throne room of Pharaoh, the air thick with the scent of incense and absolute power. He described the king himself, enthroned in gold and alabaster, surrounded by courtiers, priests, and the impassive faces of royal guards. He imbued his words with the authority of the voice from the bush, the unyielding demand of the God of Israel. "Let my people go," he intoned, the words simple, yet carrying the weight of centuries of oppression and a divine right to freedom. He gestured with the staff, not as a shepherd's crook, but as the rod of God's judgment. Then he shifted. His posture changed, his shoulders squaring, his chin lifting with a haughty, imperious tilt. He became Pharaoh. His voice, when he spoke, took on a colder, mocking tone, laced with the boredom of a god-king confronted by the pleas of insignificant slaves. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice?" he sneered, the question a dismissal of everything Moses represented. "I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." The transformation was startling. In the moonlit sand, Moses was no longer just himself. He was embodying the very obstacle he was destined to face. Aaron watched, his initial nervousness giving way to a focused intensity. When it was his turn to speak, his first attempts were halting, his voice thin against the imagined grandeur of the Egyptian court. He fumbled the phrases, his delivery lacking the conviction the moment demanded. Moses stopped him, not with criticism, but with patient redirection. He urged him to feel the words, to believe not in his own eloquence, but in the truth and the power behind them. They practiced the exchange again and again, the simple, powerful demand, meeting the cold, reptilian refusal. With each repetition, Aaron's voice grew stronger, his posture more confident. He learned to stand his ground in the face of the imagined Pharaoh's scorn, to let the divine mandate fuel his courage where his own might fail. They role-played other scenarios, each more daunting than the last. What if Pharaoh demanded a sign? Moses demonstrated the casting down of the staff, the fluid motion that would precede its terrifying transformation. Aaron practiced his reaction, not one of fear, but of steadfast witness. They practiced maintaining their unity, speaking with one voice, presenting an unbreakable front. The moon traced its slow arc across the sky as they drilled the divine script into their minds and muscles, building not just a plan, but a shared resilience. The terrifying abstract concept of confronting a king was being broken down into practiced words and rehearsed actions. The fear was still there, a cold stone in each of their bellies, but it was now joined by something new, a fragile, hard-won confidence forged in the silver-lit desert night through the simple human act of preparing together. Chapter 21. Entering Egypt. The line between the wilderness and the kingdom was not marked by a wall or a river, but by a subtle, creeping change in the earth itself. The sand, once pale and fine, grew darker, richer, holding the memory of water. The air lost its dry, scouring edge, becoming thick with the distant fertile scent of mud and blooming lotus, a perfume of power and decay that Moses had not smelled in 40 years. It was a smell that coiled in the deepest recesses of his memory, stirring ghosts of a life he had tried to bury. Then they crested a final rocky ridge, and the world fell away to reveal the heart of the empire. The Nile was a broad brown serpent of life, its surface dappled with the late afternoon sun, winding through a landscape of impossible green. Fields of emerald barley and flax stretched to the horizon, segmented by a geometric web of irrigation canals that glittered like spun silver. And beyond the fields piercing the hazy golden sky, they rose, the pyramids of Giza. From this distance, they were not man-made mountains but abstract forms, perfect triangles of such immense, silent grandeur that they seemed to be elements of the landscape itself, as natural and as ancient as the desert hills behind him. They were symbols of an eternal, unassailable power, the ultimate expression of the Pharaoh's divinity and the crushing weight of the system Moses had fled. Seeing them now, no longer as a prince from within their shadow, but as a fugitive prophet from without, sent a cold, familiar dread coiling through his veins. It was the fear of the court, of the absolute authority, of the consequences of his past. It was the fear of failure on a colossal scale. He stopped walking, his knuckles white around the staff. The journey, with all its trials and divine encounters, suddenly felt like a prelude to this single terrifying moment. He was here. The command was now a place. The promise was now a confrontation. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the slow, implacable beat of the empire before him. But as the initial wave of fear crested, he felt a shift within himself. He was not the same man who had trembled before the burning bush. He was a man who had been refined by terror and grace, who had been saved by the quick courage of his wife and the stark lesson of the covenant. He glanced beside him. Zipporah's hand found his arm, her touch a steadying pressure, her gaze fixed on the distant monuments with a calm resolve that mirrored his own. Gershom stood close to her, his small hand in hers, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with a solemn awe. And on his other side stood Aaron, his brother, his partner, his face set in a line of grim determination, ready to stand with him. He was not alone. He was anchored by his family, fortified by his faith, and armed with a hard-won understanding of the cost of obedience. The fear did not vanish, but it was no longer the master of his soul. It became a current he would navigate, a shadow he would walk through. Taking a deep, steadying breath of the heavy, familiar air, Moses took the first step off the ridge and onto the soil of Egypt, his family falling into step beside him, a small, determined vessel sailing into the heart of the storm. Chapter 22. The First Challenge. The streets of the capital were a river of humanity, flowing with a current of its own, a stark contrast to the vast, silent emptiness of the desert. The air, thick with the smells of spice, sweat, and baking bread, was a physical weight after the clean, dry air of the wilderness. The sheer noise was an assault. The braying of donkeys, the shouted haggling of merchants, the rhythmic clang of coppersmiths, and the ceaseless polyglot murmur of 1,000 conversations. Moses led his small family through the teeming chaos, his senses overwhelmed, his spirit recoiling from the press of bodies and the cacophony of a world he had long ago left behind. Every grand painted column, every glimpse of a shaven-headed priest, every striding soldier in polished scale armor was a reminder of the power structure he was here to dismantle. The pyramids, those distant triangles of stone, now felt like a physical pressure at his back, the weight of centuries of pharaonic divinity pressing down upon him. And then they saw it, the palace. It was not a single building, but a sprawling city within a city, a labyrinth of whitewashed walls, soaring gateways and colonnaded halls that shimmered in the heat. The entrance was a monumental pylon gate, its sloped sides covered in deeply carved hieroglyphs proclaiming the king's victories and his divine lineage. Flanking the gateway were two colossal statues of the seated pharaoh, his stone gaze impassive, his features idealized into an expression of eternal, unassailable power. Before these giants, the human scale felt insignificant. The approach was guarded not by a simple sentry, but by a full contingent of the royal guard, their physiques honed to perfection, their faces impassive masks beneath plumed helmets. They stood at rigid attention, their tall shield-shaped shields and bronze-tipped spears forming a living, impenetrable barrier of polished wood and gleaming metal. Moses's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs as he approached, Aaron a half-step behind him. The guards did not move, but their eyes, cold and assessing, tracked their every step. One, an officer with a golden pectoral gleaming on his chest, broke from the line. He did not speak, but his outstretched arm and open palm were a command more eloquent than any shout. Halt! Go no further. The message was absolute. They were dust, and this was the domain of a god. They would not be granted an audience. They would not even cross the threshold. For a terrifying moment, Moses felt the old paralysis returning, the fear that had once pinned him to the desert floor. The rehearsed speeches, the practiced confidence, evaporated in the face of this tangible armed authority. He saw the dismissal in the officer's eyes, the utter certainty of their inferiority. But then his fingers tightened around the staff. The feel of the gnarled wood, once a simple shepherd's tool, now a vessel of a terrifying promise, sent a jolt of remembrance through him. This was not a moment for words. Words had failed him at the bush. They would fail him here. This was a moment for a sign, a small, undeniable crack in the foundation of the world these guards took for granted. He did not look at the officer. His gaze was fixed on the ground at the man's sandaled feet. He did not speak an incantation or offer a prayer. With a motion that was both deliberate and strangely casual, he tossed the staff onto the sun-baked earth. It landed with a dull thud, a dead piece of wood against the stone paving. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The guard's expressions of bored contempt did not change. Then the wood rippled. It twisted, its form dissolving and reforming in a blur of motion that defied the eye. The familiar grain of the staff was replaced by the iridescent patterned scales of a cobra. The serpent, now fully formed and lethally alive, lifted its head, its hood flaring, a dry, menacing hiss cutting through the hum of the distant city. It coiled upon itself, a living sculpture of venom and divine power, its black, bead-like eyes fixed on the stunned guards. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. The officer stumbled back, his composure shattered, his face a mask of superstitious terror. The rigid line of guards broke, men recoiling, their spears lowering from their defensive posture as they stared at the impossible sight. This was no desert trick. This was a power from outside their understanding, a magic that did not belong to the priests of Ra or the sorcerers of Heka. It was a raw, untamed demonstration that the two dusty, insignificant men before them were backed by an authority that could make wood writhe and command the serpent itself. The small miracle was complete. The barrier of human power had been challenged not with a demand, but with a sign, and the first fragile crack in Pharaoh's invincible armor had been made. Chapter 23, a lesson learned. The hiss of the serpent seemed to hang in the air long after the staff had been restored to wood, a phantom sound echoing in the stunned silence that had fallen over the royal guards. The confrontation was over, the immediate barrier broken not by force of arms or eloquence of speech, but by a demonstration of power that bypassed human authority entirely. As Moses and Aaron retreated from the palace gates, the eyes of the guards followed them, no longer filled with contempt, but with a wary, superstitious fear. They had seen the foundations of their world tremble, and the two Hebrew men were now marked not as petitioners, but as vessels of something ancient and terrifying. Later, in the relative safety of a small rented room on the dusty fringes of the Hebrew quarter, the adrenaline of the encounter began to ebb, leaving behind a profound and sobering quiet. Moses sat alone by a small unshuttered window, looking out at the narrow shadowed street. The sounds of the city were a distant murmur, but his mind was turned inward, replaying the events of the day against the vast, painful tapestry of his entire journey. The sight of the staff transforming, the shock on the guards' faces. It was a small victory, a preliminary skirmish, but it felt like a culmination. It was the first tangible fruit of a path that had begun in fire and been watered with blood. His thoughts drifted back, not to the palace gates, but to the rocky basin in the desert, to the crushing weight of divine anger and the cold, sharp touch of the flint stone. The memory was no longer a source of paralyzing shame, but a cornerstone of understanding. He saw now with a clarity that was both humbling and empowering the unbroken line that connected the burning bush to this moment in Egypt. The voice from the fire had given the command, but his own partial obedience had nearly broken the mission before it began. He had accepted the call to liberate a nation while neglecting the covenant that defined that nation. He had been ready to speak for God, but unwilling to fully submit to God's law in his own household. The confrontation with the guards was not merely a test of the power God had given him, it was a test of the lesson God had taught him. When he had thrown down the staff, it was not an act of reckless courage or blind faith. It was an act of precise obedience, the culmination of a hard-won vow to listen fully. He had learned that true faith was not a general feeling of trust, but a specific, moment-by-moment alignment with the divine will. The power in the staff was meaningless without the obedience in the heart that wielded it. The deliverance of Israel would not be accomplished by spectacular miracles alone, but by the leader's meticulous faithfulness to the covenant that authorized those miracles. A deep, settled calm filled him, a feeling fundamentally different from the nervous determination he had carried from Midian. The fear of Pharaoh was still present, a cold, rational understanding of the man's power. The fear of failure still whispered at the edges of his consciousness. But a greater fear had been burned into him, the fear of disobedience, of stepping outside the protective boundaries of God's commands. That fear had become his compass. He knew now that the path to liberation was narrow, defined not by his own strength or wisdom, but by his willingness to listen and obey, completely and without reservation. The doubts that had once plagued him felt like the complaints of a stranger. He was no longer the man who argued at the bush. He was a man who had been remade in the desert, forged in the fire of wrath, and cooled in the blood of the covenant. He felt a readiness that had nothing to do with confidence in himself and everything to do with confidence in the one who had called him. Whatever came next, Pharaoh's refusal, the plagues, the fury of a nation, he was ready. He would face it not with the courage of a prince, but with the obedience of a servant who had finally, fully learned to listen